So welcome everyone. I'm Sylvia Chibrowski, a facilitator with Kearns and West, and you are at a kickoff meeting for the Oregon Department of Forestry's development of its companion forest management plan and implementation plans, and also an update on the Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan. And we appreciate you being here. And in a few moments, I will kick it over to Liz Dent and walk us through our agenda. But before we go there, just a couple of Zoom reminders. On the next slide, you're probably all Zoom experts by now, but just a reminder that throughout the meeting, we appreciate it if you'll just keep yourself on mute when not speaking to reduce background noise. If you have questions or comments when we get into our discussion and Q&A portions, just feel free to use the raise your hand button to get in the queue, or press *9 if you're joined by phone only. We encourage the use of video, especially when you're speaking, to kind of promote the feeling like we're in the room together. And we also encourage you to say your name and affiliation before you're speaking so we can get to know each other. And if you have any troubleshooting issues, please just send a chat message to the host, to Aaron Bothwell, or to another co-host, and we'll try to help you out there. And the meeting will include time for Q&A and input, so we're hoping to hear from you all today. And also the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Oregon Department of Forestry website after today. And then on the next slide is just a reminder of where some of the buttons live, because Zoom platforms change all the time. So mute button, left-hand corner, video button next to that. There's a participants icon. If you open that up, you can find your name and rename yourself to your name and affiliation, or however you want to be described. It's always helpful to know who's in the meeting. And then if you want to raise your hand, you just click that reactions button at the bottom and you'll find a raise hand button there. So you can use that when we get into the Q&A. All right, so with that, I am going to hand it over to Liz Dent to kick us off with an intro, and we can take down the slides for now. And you're on mute, Liz.
What a great start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to check in with us on the processes that we have in place to develop new policy for management of state forests. So there is a lot to cover, and so I'm going to just really give you a short introduction to our plan for the day. And a little feel for where we are. So many of you have been following the development of the Habitat Conservation Plan for Western Oregon, and we completed the first administrative draft of that HCP at the end of March and submitted it into the Nepa process. And so the Nepa process has been kicked off, and the lead agency for that is NOAA Fisheries. So we're turning our attention largely to the development of a companion forest management plan. A habitat conservation plan really just deals with one aspect of managing our forests for conservation purposes and protection of threatened and endangered species. And we really need, there's a lot more that is entailed in managing these state forests. And so the forest management plan really sets forth the goals and strategies for a holistic management of state forests. So that's why we're developing a companion forest management plan. We had worked on a revised forest management plan for several years and put that on hold last April while we really focused on the habitat conservation plan. So we're headed into working on that companion forest management plan. Today, we want to share when and where you'll be able to share input on the process of developing that forest management plan, and also provide updates on what's happening with NEPA and the habitat conservation plan. For the forest management plan, we'll be focusing on getting public engagement at points in the processes and topics where your input can really make a difference. We want to provide a meaningful engagement. We know there are a lot of questions on the draft habitat conservation plan, but for today we want to cover the forest management plan first, and then we'll go over the administrative draft of the Habitat Conservation Plan and highlight some of the key changes that were made between when it was last shared in October of 2019 and then the final draft version that was submitted in just this past March. So we'll highlight some of those key changes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions. Any further changes to the Habitat Conservation Plan will all be facilitated through the federal process. So it's best to place your comments and review and comments, I should say, once there is a draft environmental impact statement, and we expect that to come somewhere in the fall of 2021. So to kind of sum it up, we do have a lot of planning levels when it comes to managing state forests. And so it can be a little complicated. So the Habitat Conservation Plan, I think people are well familiar with at this point. The Forest Management Plan that couples with it. And then we have a set of implementation plans. And the implementation plans really scale down spatially. So it characterizes what we're going to do at smaller scales and also in smaller time frames. So if we're successful with an HCP and the board approves it in 2023, that's a 70-year plan. The Forest Management Plan should work in tandem with the Habitat Conservation Plan, but it could be a shorter time period to kick it off. And then with the implementation plans, right now, those are written at district levels, and their lifespan is about 10 years. So multiple levels going on, and our approach is to have all of that packaged up, the HCP after it comes through the EIS process, this companion forest management plan, and a set of implementation plans as one package to bring to the Board of Forestry in 2023 for them to make their final decision as to if they want to adopt the FMP and HCP as the guiding policies for managing state forests. And that work around the IPs really does allow us to do, and meaning implementation plans, really does allow us to get a little bit more detailed and have greater certainty around what we think those outcomes would be through managing with the FMP and the HCP. So that's all I had for opening remarks, Sylvia. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that context for us today. Erin, if you can bring up the slides again, I'll just walk through our agenda, and Liz highlighted a lot of the pieces that we'll be talking through today. And before I go over the agenda, we're also going to launch a quick poll. We have a lot of people in the room today and won't have time to do a round of introductions of everyone, but do want to kind of get a sense of who's here in the room. So you should have gotten a poll pop up on your screen right now. If you can just kind of let us know what best describes who you are, we'd appreciate it. And we'll just keep that open for a bit while I go through the agenda. So we're doing our opening right now, and we're going to have two main topics today, like Liz said. So an overview of the companion forest management plan and the implementation plans, and we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion there. And want to kind of hear at a high level your thoughts on the forest management plan going forward. And then we'll have updates on the Western Oregon Habitat Conservation Plan and the Nepa process. So we'll hear from Troy Ramig with ICF and ODF staff, and then also from Terry O'Rourke with NOAA Fisheries, and we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. Then we'll end with some next steps. And that's kind of the first portion of our meeting today for kind of a couple of hours. And then at 4 o'clock, we have an informal discussion on topics of interest. We've done this before in our meetings. It's really just a time, if we didn't get to enough of your questions or comments in the previous topics, we just have an hour for anyone that wants to stay on to talk about anything that's of interest to you. And so if we go to the next slide, just some discussion guidelines and reminders for the meeting today. Please try to honor the agenda and keep topic keep your comments related to the topics that we're talking about, and we have that last hour to talk about anything else. We'll ask for a balance of speaking time. So we'll, if we have a lot of hands up, we might kind of go through the queue to make sure we're hearing from new people. We encourage you to listen as much as possible, try to listen to understand and ask questions to clarify, and really taking into account each other's points of view, values, and interests, and focusing comments on the topics on the hand. We call it being hard on the issues and soft on the people, so that we can really get to the core issues and substance of topics. And so with that, let's jump into the next slide, which I think is our next topic. And I'll go ahead and close the poll. Most of you have participated, and here's kind of the results. Thanks everyone for participating. We have a broad range of interests represented today. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to introduce herself and kick us off with the FMP presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Lathrop, and I serve as the State Forest Operations Project Leader. And Mike Wilson, our Acting Deputy Chief of State Forest, is actually going to open the topic today by covering several slides to give an overview of the transition to the companion forest management plan development and IP development. So we will go ahead and get started with Mike.
Thank you, Sarah. And my day job is I am the Resource Support Unit Manager for the division. I've been a member of the scoping team throughout the HCP process, and now am involved in the FMP, companion FMP process. So what I'll do today is I'm going to provide an overview of the planning structure and how the companion forest management plan and implementation plans fit with the HCP. And Sarah will provide more details on the FMP project timeline, structure, project team structure, engagement plan, and key dates. So this slide basically shows our hierarchical planning format. And ODF manages Oregon State Forest to achieve greatest permanent value for Oregonians, which involves providing a balance among social, economic, and conservation values. And so using this tiered approach is how we go from high-level goals to implementing on the ground. So forest management plans, or FMPs, provide for high-level management goals and strategies. The Board of Forestry adopts an FMP as Oregon administrative rule after making a finding that the FMP will achieve greatest permanent value. Habitat conservation plans, or HCPs, are a mechanism by which non-federal landowners such as ODF can comply with Federal Endangered Species Act. While forest management plans are not required to be coupled with HCPs, HCPs provide assurances that allow for more certain and cost-effective implementation of those FMPs. An HCP serves to provide the bulk of the conservation strategies for the FMP, so they really do complement one another. Implementation plans are the mid-range plans that describe the current condition of the forest and serve to set discrete objectives for specific geographic areas and timeframes to provide orderly progress towards those FMP goals. Under the current FMP, IPs have been developed at the district level with a 10-year time horizon. Under the new FMP, the geographic scope may change from district to something else, and the time horizon might be somewhat different. That has not been fully decided at this point. Annual operations plans detail the specific management actions for the upcoming fiscal year and describe how those actions fulfill the IP objectives. So AOPs are the, provide the project level detail to support the implementation plan objectives, to support the FMP and HCP goals. Okay, so next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about the plan contents, what each one contains. So the forest management plan, as I mentioned, is adopted by the Board of Forestry, and it's a strategic level plan adopted as administrative rule. So that equals GPV. It is a long range plan. It does not have a specific time horizon, even though it may have dates in it that at which it will be reviewed. So it's meant to be something that sustains over a long, long period of time. It contains guiding principles, goals for forest resources, strategies to implement those goals, guidelines for implementation plans and asset management, and different implementation levels that are tied to budget. Implementation plans are approved by the state forester. Those are tactical plans. Like I said, at this point, they're 10-year plans and they're done by district. And they achieve a specific set of objectives for the FMP. Like I said, they're 10-year plans. So they contain a district overview of key resources and land ownership, different management opportunities. The annual harvest objective for timber harvest is outlined in those plans or set in those plans. The current forest structure is described as well as a desired future condition. Annual operations plans that are approved by the district forester. Those are very operational plans, as I said before, meant to achieve IP objectives. And they have the description of the specific harvest operations and other forest projects, habitat improvements, young stand management activities, specific recreation items, road management, and monitoring and research. So next slide, please. The plan, the FMP resource goals. This shows the goals that are in the current draft FMP that was basically presented to the board in April of 2020 and has been sitting there since. But these goals you can see how some of them overlap with HCP goals, such as wildlife and aquatics. They overlap considerably, while others have less overlap. And so in this respect, the FMP and HCP have to complement one another because neither one tells the entire story. Next slide. There are other efforts related to FMP planning. The Recreation, Education, and Interpretation program has strategic level planning. Those are going to be conducted in 2 phases. Phase 1 is a program visioning that is going to happen that started in spring of 2021, and phase 2, comprehensive strategic planning, which will begin this fall and go through the winter. The Santiam Restoration Plan is another key component or key planning effort that's related to the FMP. And it really supports development of content in the FMP going forward and IPs related to the management of catastrophic events. Needless to say, the Labor Day fires were a pretty huge event. And in terms of our management of the forest as an agency, is really the first time that we've dealt with it when it happened. Many people know we inherited the Tillamook burn more or less in a rehabilitation phase, but when the burn actually happened, ODF was not managing those lands. So this really provides us with an effort to not only focus on the Santiam, but it also serves as a useful template exercise for learning how to build these types of response to these types of events into the forest management plan. And then there's a climate change and carbon plan, which will support development of climate change and carbon related content in the FMP and the IPs and AOPs as well. So, the department, this is an internal carbon, part of this is an internal carbon pricing process that the department and specifically the State Forest Division needs to work towards determining and then for the lands and forests that we manage. And having this information incorporated into future forest management planning and decisions is part of this. So next slide, please. So as we move into building the companion forest management plan, our starting point is really the draft Western Oregon Forest Management Plan that was paused in 2020 while we completed the HCP effort and put the HCP into Nepa. There are 11 guiding principles in that plan that were approved by the Board of Forestry, and that and much of the work that we've done on that plan makes it a good starting point to develop a companion FMP for this HCP. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah to talk more about the actual project timeline and logistics.
Thank you, Mike. So as mentioned earlier, my name is Sarah Lathrop, and I serve as the Operations Project Leader for the State Forest Division. Today, I'll be covering the working project timeline, the project organization, our plan for public and stakeholder engagement, next steps for the project team, and upcoming key dates and milestones. We will begin with the project timeline. In this graphic, the blue row at the top of the picture is the companion FMP timeline. The green row at the bottom is the implementation plan timeline. The months highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the timeline are Board of Forestry meetings we are scheduled to present the project. We are currently in the planning phase of the project and preparing for execution, which will begin on June 1st. The project team will lead the companion FMP development, and the implementation plans will be developed on a staggered timeline. We expect the actual drafting of the implementation plans will begin about a year from now, as the content and framework are dependent on the companion forest management plan strategies. The execution phase for the development of the companion FMP is divided into 3 subphases. The subphases include draft, which has a 10-month duration, refine with a 6-month duration, and rulemaking and finalization with a 4-month duration. We anticipate the companion FMP will be presented to the Board of Forestry for approval in February of 2023. The execution phase for the implementation plans is divided into 4 subphases. These include data preparation with a 6-month duration, draft, which includes modeling, analysis, and plan development with a 1-year duration, refine with a 6-month duration, and lastly, a public comment period followed by planned finalization and submission to the State Forester for approval in spring of 2023. Our core project team kickoff was held on April 15th, and the team is now meeting weekly. The first core team deliverable will be the development of a detailed companion FMP work plan. This will be a detailed content delivery schedule that we will use to develop the companion FMP. The work plan will also be used as the basis for building meaningful public engagement opportunities that are topic specific. I will provide more information on the public engagement later in this presentation. The last item that's really important to call out in the timeline is that we're beginning the execution phase at the beginning of fire season and also the heavy recreation season. The State Forest Division is committed to supporting our protection from fire division and will take fire season into account as we develop the companion FMP work plan. Next slide, please. So here we're going to transition to the project organization. Starting at the top of the chart, there are 2 approval pathways for the companion FMP and IPs. The Board of Forestry is the approval authority for the companion FMP, and the State Forester is the approval authority for the IPs. Our project sponsor is Liz Dent, the State Forest Division Chief, and the steering committee consists of Lena Tucker, our ODF Deputy State Forester, Andy White, the Northwest Oregon Area Director, and Dave Larson, the Southern Oregon Area Director. Our leadership group consists of the state forest leaders in critical areas, including policy, planning, operations, recreation, education, interpretation, habitat conservation planning, and district engagement. I am the project manager, and Nick Palazzotto is the technical lead for the project. Jody Kroon from our State Forest Planning and Coordination team will be the implementation plan coordinator for the project. With the complex nature of this project, it is acknowledged that there will be many contributors along the way. The core project team will be considered the hub for project collaboration and information sharing. The core team has both headquarters staff and field representation. For the purpose of time, I won't cover every specialist included, but I can confirm that this is a strong interprofessional team designed for this planning effort. The field representation on the core team consists of a district forester and 3 operations foresters representing the North Coast, the Valley, and the South, who will advise in operational topics and spearhead field engagement efforts. In order to keep the core project team at a manageable size, it was decided that several resource groups will be developed to support an inclusive and collaborative work. The resource groups are the Operational Advisory Group, the ODF Subject Matter Expert Group, the Partner Agency Group, and the Contractor Consultant Group. The Operational Advisory Group consists primarily of State Forest District Operations Coordinators who will be consulted on a biweekly basis on operations and strategies for implementing the HCP and FMP. The ODF Subject Matter Expert Group consists of internal experts in a variety of fields, including but not limited to climate change and carbon, insect and disease, entomology, road coordination, GIS, and others. This group will be consulted and coordinated with on topics relevant to their specialty throughout the process. The Partner State Agency Group consists of technical staff from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Environmental Quality, and the Department of State Lands. These agencies will be consulted on a monthly basis as content development begins. And lastly, the Contractor Consultant Group currently consists of Kearns and West, who is supporting our public and stakeholder engagement process, and ICF, who is supporting Habitat Conservation Plan development. We do expect this group to expand this summer as we solicit for professional services to support the companion FMP and implementation plan development effort. As you can see, there is a wide variety of professionals with diverse experiences and values joining this effort. It is my sincere hope as we move forward that we can leverage our differences and diverse viewpoints to generate positive change for the division and for Oregonians. Next slide, please. So next we'll cover the high level and overview of the plan for public and stakeholder engagement. For the duration of the project, the division will be working with Kearns and West to develop a strong and meaningful public engagement process. The engagement process will be similar to that of the HCP, but we will be building upon lessons learned over time. We want to ensure the process is meaningful. So we are exploring several different types of engagement opportunities that go beyond informational updates to include workshops and focus groups. The division and Kearns and West are currently working to finalize a formal public and stakeholder engagement plan, which will be made available on the public-facing project website soon. Our primary goals for public engagement are to fully inform counties, tribes, stakeholders, and the general public throughout the FMP process, and to provide opportunities to engage and offer input at multiple levels throughout the process. We want the team, when the team has the companion FMP work plan completed, more public engagement opportunities will be made available. Next slide, please. To close, I'd like to quickly cover next steps and highlight some of the key dates and events that are approaching. As mentioned earlier, our core team is now meeting on a weekly basis. The first deliverable is the companion FMP work plan. While developing the work plan, we will determine chapter leads, prioritize forest management plan content. We will develop a schedule for FMP workshops, analyze linkages to the HCP, and identify implementation plan dependencies. We will also discuss fire season strategies to ensure our delivery schedule stays on track. The division will also be focused on HCP knowledge equalization to ensure the core team has the needed foundation to begin brainstorming management and implementation strategies. In addition, our State Forest Planning and Coordination team is conducting implementation planning and data preparation. Model data updates have begun, and soon our districts will be engaged in this process, starting with updates to model harvest units. Next slide, please. This last slide is simply for situational awareness. In June, we will be giving an informational update on the project to the Board of Forestry and would encourage and welcome everyone to join and view that. And I also wanted to share that we do have 2 known dates for future public engagement, which are scheduled for April 2021 and April 2022. As mentioned earlier, as we develop the FMP work plan, we will be solidifying some additional opportunities for engagement in the actual development process. So we want to make sure that we're focusing in on the topics that are going to be most meaningful for engagement, and to form those engagement opportunities to ensuring that they're helpful to the process. So looking forward to solidifying those in the engagement plan. With that, that's the end of the FMP and IP project update. And Sylvia, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Mike, too, for that great context. And we'll open it up to kind of Q&A and discussion now. And if we go into the next slide, we certainly want to take time for any clarifying questions you have of ODF on the process or the companion FMP and the implementation plans in general. And then also would encourage some early input on the substance of the FMP and the process. So, maybe thinking about the current FMP or state forest management, what do you think is working really well, and what do you want to make sure continues in terms of the FMP, and kind of what would you change and why? Hearing that would be really helpful at this early phase. And then on the process side, we're also really interested to hear what you're most interested in engaging on. So thinking about all the various elements of the FMP, are there certain topics or issues that you think are really critical for your engagement or stakeholder and public engagement in general, so that as we build out an engagement plan, we can keep all of that in mind. And so we can take down the slides now, and would encourage anyone that has a question or a comment or any kind of input at this time to just go ahead and raise your hand in the platform. And again, you can do that by sort of finding the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, click on that, and you'll find a raise hand button there. And great, and we have Doug has raised his hand. So Doug, go ahead, and just a reminder to please just say your name and affiliation before you speak so we can all know each other. Thanks.
Yep, Doug Cooper with Hampton Lumber. I guess one question to start off with, could you say, have you identified all the members of the steering committee yet? And if you have, I guess, could you say who they are?
Certainly. So I did mention the steering committee members. It's very small, and it's an internal group for the FMP process. It's Liz Dent. She's our sponsor. It's Andy White from the Northwest Oregon area. He's the director. It is Lena Tucker, our deputy state forester. And it is the Dave Larson, who's the incoming Southern Oregon area director. Those are the steering committee members for this effort.
Okay, thanks. I did hear those, but I guess I was a little surprised at what a small group and kind of narrow group that it really is. Did you consider adding any other members? I guess I'll say from the counties, maybe certainly specifically, or any outside agency or stakeholder groups?
I think it's something that we absolutely could consider. And I will probably turn it over to Liz as our convening member for that committee. I think we're open to that, but want to make sure that she would be on board. So turning it over to Liz.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so the reason the team is small and internal, I'll start there, is it's the role and purpose of the steering committee is really to track the work that's getting done and to give the project team a place to vet questions around really high level direction of the work that they're doing. So it really is as much around project management as it is, it really isn't around policy development. That's not what the team does. So it's really just an organizational structure, Doug. So I'm not sure that would be the home for what you're talking about, but we can definitely think around, is there some other team that meets, I'm guessing, the goals that you're thinking of for the counties is that they're really folded right into the policy development piece. Is that fair to say where the question is?
Oh, definitely. And,
Yeah.
so that was one of the I guess, topics of discussion or concerns about the HCP steering committee and scoping committee, the formation and participation of those two committees. So yeah, that was definitely what I was thinking about.
Thank you for that. This is really a much different function. The other thing that we have found in the past is the real benefit of having the leadership in the agency really tracking the work that's getting done, but it's really at a very high level. So that, for instance, fire season comes in and the barn is empty, right? We've got the leadership within the agency really tracking what that means for our work on the forest management plan. So those are the kinds of things that the steering committee handles, but we'll definitely talk more around a different role for the counties. We do, very important to us is the Forest Trust Lands Advisory Committee Forum. That's a place where, they're the board of the Council of Forest Trust Land Counties, which is made up by the 15 counties within which we manage Board of Forestry lands. And then they serve as this advisory committee to the board. And we really rely on that group chaired by Dave Yamamoto. We really rely on that forum and that group for these types of discussions.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Doug, for the question. And I also just want to clarify, just responding to the piece on the HCP steering committee, for those that might not know, for the Habitat Conservation Plan, there was a steering committee formed as well as a scoping team formed, made up of state and federal agencies that advised on development of that Habitat Conservation Plan. And they are continuing to meet in relation to the Habitat Conservation Plan, and we'll get updates on the FMP and discuss topics as they're related to the Habitat Conservation Plan. So those groups didn't go away, I guess, is just what I want to say as we move forward. All right, let's see, we have a hand up from Heath. Go ahead, Heath.
Yeah, Heath Curtis, also with Hampton Lumber. You mentioned in passing very quickly a carbon plan, and I don't know that I had heard about that before. Can you tell us anything more about what that is?
Sure. So one of the things that we need to do as a state agency actually is have a carbon plan. And so we're trying to figure out, that is definitely in early draft stage. And it applies to the agency as a whole. There's some issues in there for state forests to deal with, and determining, as I mentioned, determining an internal carbon price for the lands and forests that we manage is part of that. And then there's also a piece that we had already started down this road with the previous draft, and in trying to incorporate climate change into the FMP process, which, for us has always had to do with maintaining a resilient forest, in response to a variety of disturbances or environmental situations outside of our control. But then also, things like identifying areas that are maybe especially sensitive to climate threats and working to conserve those, and restoring insect and disease impacted areas to improve productive forests. So for instance, trying to, and it really goes hand in glove with a lot of our other forest health issues, like dealing with Swiss needlecast and so forth. And then also identifying areas that might be good areas for high carbon storage areas. And so as you can imagine, there'd be a lot of overlap with some of the HCP strategies in that sense. So it's really about trying to make the resilient forest, identify areas that are particularly at risk, and then also, find where our strategies can complement each other to achieve some carbon storage benefit as well.
Will there be opportunities between now and October for the public to be involved in development of whatever that is?
That plan exists outside of just the State Forest Division, and so I'm not really sure what the timeline is for that plan and what the what engagement process there might be, but Liz probably has a little more intel on that.
Not a whole lot. We just got a draft to review. I think it was just last week, Heath. And so, but what I can, so it's being led by the technical group within the Partnership and Planning program at ODF, Danny Norlander and John Karsek. So, but we can certainly follow up on what public engagement looks like and timeframes.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Heath. All right, others, any other questions, comments, thoughts on the FMP, or, you know, any ideas for engagement or pieces where you want to make sure we focus on engagement? Let's see, Laura, you got your hand up.
Sorry to make this the Hampton question hour. So just curious, so I noticed that it just said October and then April of next year were going to be the public meetings, the next one's scheduled. Are there going to be like sidebar stakeholder meetings going on in between those? It just seems like even October is a long time, and then April of next year is even longer. So just curious if there's going to be more engagement opportunities, and if there are, when is that schedule going to be released?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'll take that one. So we haven't set dates in between now in October, just because we don't have our content delivery schedule ready. So the core team is working on developing a very detailed content delivery schedule for the FMP. And what our goal is to involve public and stakeholders in the development process so that input is meaningful, right? So if we're developing a certain strategy or a certain topic, we want to make sure that we involve the right stakeholders at the right time so that input can be gathered and considered for the plan itself. So we haven't solidified those dates just simply because we don't know when we're covering which topics at this time. So hopefully that helps. There will be more opportunities. We just don't know dates and times yet.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, Laura. And we have, I think, a physical hand up from somebody who's got a TRY in his Zoom name. Go ahead.
Oops. Am I able to be heard at this point?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep. That first name is Trigvi, not pronounced by most people. I'm curious, how does one access or be able to become part of the carbon planning process? It sounds like it's a little bit off to the side and shut off from the general public. Can there be a provision for public involvement with that planning process? And if so, how could one be part of that?
Yeah, this is Liz Dent again. I just sent a note to our colleagues that are working on the carbon plan and asked exactly those questions. What's the process for public engagement and what are the timelines? So if I hear back before the meeting's over, we can put that in the chat or share it.
And I have your email address. So Liz, just connect with me and I can make sure that he gets that.
Okay.
Thank you for your help.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and just to make sure everybody knows that, you know, not knowing, we'll find out what that process is, but then definitely, you know, the engagement plan that Sarah outlined in terms of how our forest management plan addresses carbon and climate change. You can be fully part of that through that engagement plan, kind of regardless of what the other plan's input is.
Yeah, because in reality, in my view, the carbon plan would need to intrinsically involve some care and attention to rotation length, given that older trees store carbon more effectively. And rotation length, for me, is a long-term concern in relation to state forest management.
That's a great comment for us to capture, sort of going back to the question Sylvia posed, you know, sort of what's important to you in the forest management plan. I think the way we would capture that is rotation ages for carbon sequestration. Does that represent your concept there?
Exactly, because I mean, it's carbon sequestration as an increasingly significant emerging issue. But for me, it's actually been part of my input to ODF for actually several decades, because it impinges on the ability of state forests to be a biodiversity reserve in relation to private lands intensive management, where biodiversity is impacted and sacrificed in the interest of their goals. And so I think ODF has a really important role to play in being a counterbalance to the way private lands are being managed.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Trygve.
Thank you.
And Pamela, go ahead and just a reminder to say your name and affiliation if you have one.
Yes, thank you. My name is Pamela Webb, and I am a county commissioner in Clatsop County. Are you all going to have a special, a special place on the ODF website that's going to be particular to loading lots of information about these processes that are going on at the same time? And for instance, the presentation today, which I found extremely useful, is that available anywhere? Is that accessible? I have a lot of people to explain issues like this to, and that would really be a great help. It was a terrific presentation. So where can we access some of that?
I can take that on. So we have the Habitat Conservation Plan website, as well as the FMP website, which Sylvia just dropped in the chat. We'll typically be cross-linking the presentations, particularly as they pertain, you know, an example like this one where we're really discussing both projects. What we'll do is we'll take the video from today and put it up on YouTube and then link that from the ODF website.
The video including the oral part of the presentation?
Yeah, everything we're capturing today, including you and I talking about the video, will be on the video.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thanks, Jason. And also just a reminder that you can sign up for updates about the process on ODF's website, and we can probably put that in the chat as well in case you're not already signed up. Okay. Any other questions or comments on the FMP, or topics and issues related to the FMP that you want to make sure you get to engage on? As kind of Sarah said, the team is building the work plan and the engagement process. Okay, well, we're a little ahead of schedule, but I think, oh wait, we've got another hand up. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at the FMP since you put it out last year about this time. But what I remember about it was that it was, what would you say? That it was sort of aspirational in tone, but real short on specifics and outcomes. And that you got a lot of comments to that effect. You've had a year to work on it or think about it since then. Is that changing, or is it still going to look like it did a year ago?
So yeah, I'll take that. It is changing, Mark. So at that time, you're right. Obviously, there was a lot of people wanted more detail in that plan. From the standpoint of this being a companion forest management plan effort now, the HCP fills in a lot of gaps clearly on the strategy detail for conservation. And so one of our challenges now is to define the timber management strategy more definitely. as well as other resource goals in the plan. We do still plan to anchor into having measurable outcomes and key performance measures that are meaningful. And also, of course, the adaptive management framework will, I anticipate, remain the same as it is, probably very few tweaks there.
So will you show a projected harvest level in the FMP?
The projected harvest levels, we will be refining those estimates as part of the FMP and IP development process. That modeling effort, we will be doing updates and so forth to data updates over the summer, probably into the early fall. And then this fall, we anticipate beginning actual modeling. And, you're very familiar with that. And so we'll be addressing, just some of our core data updates that go along with that sort of thing, various GIS layers and whatnot. And then also trying to get more specific in some respects around the harvest scheduling modeling itself, so that we can get more and more precise estimates of those outcomes.
Okay.
And it's not just about timber harvest. For those on the line who aren't as familiar with our modeling, we have these outcomes. We have several habitat models in the HCP that are tied also to the forest inventory metrics. And so it'll give us a more precise outcome or projection of both harvest and habitat outcomes.
And will that, Mike, will that be in the FMP or just the IPs? Those kinds of projections?
I guess that's a good question as to where they actually get housed. I mean, clearly the IP will have it because the IP will continue to set that annual harvest objective or some sort of harvest objective. It may not be the average annual harvest objective, given that we may entertain a departure and so forth over time.
Yeah.
We'll certainly outline what the harvest objectives are for the IP period. And then whether harvest projections are, I believe in our original forest management plan, those were presented as an appendix, if I recall correctly, regarding the scenarios that were modeled there. So I don't know if we'll incorporate those in quite the same format or not.
Okay, well, I guess the thing I always wonder about is how or whether the Board of Forestry could make a determination of greatest permanent value if it couldn't see some pretty specific outcomes.
And those will be presented to the board for sure.
Okay.
I'm just talking about in the document itself, how it gets presented, but definitely all of the outcomes of this process will be given to the board. That really has to be so that they can make that GPV determination, that finding.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, you bet.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mike. Mark, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Mark Rogers. I'm the chair of the Oregon Council of Trout Unlimited. It'll probably come as no surprise that our interest is in clean and abundant water for wildlife, fish, and for human supply. And I don't have a particular question at this point. It's kind of early days in your process here, but I just want to make sure that we'd like to be involved, and I'm sure there's a number of other interests that would like to be involved to make sure that we have adequate protections for water. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. And Seth.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of dates anyway in front of the Board of Forestry, and I'm not sure if there's other engagements there, but I'm curious, and of course you guys don't have a crystal ball looking forward into October and April of next year to see, in-person sort of things. But assuming we're in a scenario similar to what we are right now, where those board meetings are virtual, and I hope that's wrong, but nevertheless, do you anticipate those being informational hearings where there will not be opportunity for public comment? So I guess my question is, when's the opportunity for public comment, if there is any, with the board? And then when's the opportunity for board? When are you soliciting board information? And when is it more than just a sort of update to the board, but rather an engagement with the board? So if you could characterize those two board meetings, it looks like those are the only two right now engagements, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure, I'll tackle that. This is Liz Dent. So the first question about public comment at board meetings, I know that the new board chair and state forester and Hillary, who helps basically run board meetings and everything needed to pull materials together for the board meetings, they are talking about this exact item, Seth, how to handle, what does it look like to create space for public comment outside of decision items? Because as you alluded to the past year with the pandemic, the framework has been to have verbal public comment only on decision items. Written public comments are always welcome and encouraged. And certainly some of the board members are committed to reading all of those. So short answer is, I think there's going to be a change this year to allow public comment outside of decision items, but that is yet to be determined. So we shall see. I don't want people to write home about that, but I think that we can expect something like that. The second one is a great question about working with the board. And there's a couple ways we do that, which we brief them throughout the year between the board meetings and seek to answer their questions and get their input. And at board meetings, we are characterizing these as updates, but certainly the board is in a place to provide feedback and input. And the degree to which they, as a body, give direction, certainly we will follow that. So that's the reason we're calling it an update is simply because it's not a decision item. They kind of, fall in those couple of different categories. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess I was curious to see how it would play out this year. I know in years past, Liz, you guys have created a subcommittee of the board, when you were looking at land allocation and like the 70-30 sort of stuff. I remember at that point there was a subcommittee of the board that really dug in with more substantive conversation. I was just curious if that sort of thing was going to perhaps surface again, but it doesn't sound like it.
We don't have a plan for that. But there were some pros and cons to that for sure. The chance for that subset of board members to really, like you said, to really kind of get to know the work at a deeper level is really good. The challenge is the other board members that aren't spending that kind of time on it. Then when it comes to the full board meeting, there's this kind of inequity of knowledge and engagement. So it did create some challenges that way. There may be another model that still arrives at that same desired outcome of getting some more detailed input from the board. So we can certainly chew on that.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Seth. And Seth, did you have a second part to your question around engagement at these kinds of meetings or engagement outside of Board of Forestry meetings?
No, I think you kind of answered that in a previous question. Unless there's something more to say there, I'd be curious. But mine was really more about Board of Forestry meetings. But I'd be curious. I mean, if there's anything more to add there, happy to listen. It sounds like you guys are planning on some engagement outside of those with individual groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Sarah wants to say more about that, but the dates up there of October and then April 2022 were just the minimal what's on the schedule now. Sarah, do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say the scheduled dates are for the wide public interaction, right? So the big scale, everyone's invited. The ones in between will likely be more focused on content development and input. So focusing in with groups on certain subject matter that would be relevant.
Thank you. And let's see, Josie.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Can't tell.
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it seems to me there's a lot of interest around the idea of the public not just having sort of a one-off chance to provide input or reaction to something. I think there is an interest in engaging together in discussions about carbon sequestration and about harvest that needs to happen, you know, in a more discussion-like format, more of a task force. Because I think so that, you know, there's a lot of talking through of possible ideas that could be then provide input into the Fmp group.
Yeah, thank you, Josie.
Yeah, thank you for that, Josie. For those of you that may or may not be familiar, we do have a State Forest Advisory Committee, which is a citizen volunteer group of people with a broad range of interests and perspectives that we do utilize more and more for policy discussions. Just for an awareness piece, I don't know if that meets the intention of sort of what your idea that you're presenting, but I've jotted it down and we can certainly kick that around internally some more.
I'm just wondering if that's a fixed group or is it a flexible group or does it change or is it appointed?
It does change. There's a sort of an outreach / solicitation for membership. And then there's a process by which those folks are selected to be on the advisory committee. So it does flux. There's service periods, if you will, or terms. So we can share more about that in a follow-up to let folks know how that group functions, and their public meetings. And they have testified the past few board meetings. As far as our the draft habitat conservation plan, the revised forest management plan that we put on the record last April. Trying to think, there's a couple other recent times that they've testified to the board. And they really, in those testimonies, Lisa Phipps, I think I'm remembering her name properly, is the chair for that committee right now. And she really characterizes the range of input. So we go and we present what we're working on, and then she characterizes the range of feedback that she hears from that group. And that's what she's presented to the board. Because with that type of diversity in the group, there isn't necessarily a single message that comes out of those conversations. But yeah, I think this is an important moment in time, and ideally we can bring people together in a collaborative way that really helps us to develop something that has broad support.
Thank you, Liz and Josie. Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts on the FMP?
I did get an email back from the folks working on the carbon project, and I can sort of share that with y'all. I'm not the person in the process, so I probably couldn't answer follow-up questions, but you want me to share that real quickly?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, I'm flipping over to my email, so we'll see how this goes. The plan is in May to have, late May, to have a kickoff to share how the plan is being developed and to initiate a public comment process. which we'll be asking, the agency would be looking for input on the draft. And it would be released at that time. So late May, I think I saw a date of May 27th. Then there's a series of targeted engagement meetings over the summer to look through the lens of industry and conservation, urban forestry, and diversity, equity, inclusion as examples. And then revise the plan throughout the spring and summer and frame up a workshop for the board to review that input and lead towards a decision by the end of 2021. So currently there's an internal review going on. Mike has referenced that. And I believe the board of forestry also is taking a look at the draft. So that's what I know based on a quick email back and forth.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Liz. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions or comments on this topic, we can move into an update on the habitat conservation plan effort and also the Nepa process on the HCP. So I'm going to hand it over to Troy to kick us off on that topic.
Excellent. Thanks, Sylvia. And hi, everybody. Troy Ramick with ICF. I'm the project manager for the HCP technical team. And what I'm going to do today is kind of kick us off, and then you'll hear from a few other folks that I'll talk about in a second. Let me share my screen here. And as the kickoff here, my idea is just to give you a little bit of background on where we are. Many of you have been following along on this process for a while, and so some of this won't be news to you, but if you're new to the process, we'll try to kind of catch you up here in the next few minutes. What I'd like to do is just walk through a little bit about the timeline. You heard about that earlier from Liz in the opening, and how all of these things play together, and probably most importantly, the next opportunity for you all to really engage and provide comments in the process, and then give a little bit of an update on the HCP itself, namely the fact that there is an administrative draft now posted to the ODF website, which you probably know about, and I'll give just a quick update on what that admin draft is and how it's different from what you've seen in the past. Hand it over to Terry O'Rourke from NOAA Fisheries, who's going to give us a short update on the Nepa process as that's underway. And then Mike Wilson and Nick Palazzotto are going to give us a little bit more technical detail on some of the key elements in the HCP that have changed since the October draft, which was the last one that was posted. So let's see here, just a quick note on the graphic. And so we've already today been talking about several of these processes, and this graphic, as some of you have seen it before, but it attempts to show all three of them at the same time. And because they are all moving sort of in parallel, the top line here shows the HCP timeline, the middle green line shows the Nepa timeline, and the bottom shows the FMP timeline. And obviously this FMP timeline is a higher level than what you saw just a minute ago in the previous presentation. And then just to orient you, we're here in May of 2021, and this takes us through early 2023. So that's kind of our planning horizon here. Two things I just wanted to point out. I'm not going to say anything really about the FMP process, except that it's happening in parallel, as we already talked about a minute ago. But with respect to the HCP process, and then related to that, the Nepa process, right now, because we posted that administrative draft HCP to the ODF website on March 31st, you can see here that the HCP process is gone and is going a little quiet for a while the Nepa process plays out. We'll talk more about that in a second, and Terry will give an update on that. But the point of that, pointing that out, is that that draft is available on the website. Many of you have probably looked at it or are looking at it, and I'm going to provide a little bit of information about what's in there and how it's changed, and some other resources that are available to give you that information if you need it. And then I guess I would just say that at this point in time, if you, as you're looking at that administrative draft, if you have any questions about it, or if you need help finding something in there, because it is a big document, you could reach out certainly to Cindy Kolomachek or myself, and we can help make sure that you get in the right place at the right time. And then the NEPA process is underway and playing out right now. And I think the thing I wanted to just highlight for this group is that really the next time or opportunity for public engagement in this process or public comment on this process will be during the official NEPA public review period. And that's set, kind of loosely here for the December, January timeframe at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And we'll know more about the actual timing of that as that time gets closer. And it's a required public review period. And during that time, both the public draft EIS, which is the NEPA document, and the public draft HCP will be available for public review at the same time. So again, 45 days, that's the required time period, and we'll be soliciting feedback on both of those documents. And then any comments that are received on either or both of those documents will be received, reviewed, and there'll be response to comments provided out to everybody, but then also as part of the final EIS. So I just wanted to point that out. So for those of you who have been following along for a long time, the next kind of important point of engagement on the HCP and the EIS will be in that kind of December, January timeframe. And I'll leave the rest of the kind of NEPA updates, et cetera, to Terry in a few minutes here. But before we get to that, a couple of things just to point out. So it's, I think Liz mentioned at the top, the last time we posted a draft of the HCP was back in October of 2020. And we did that ahead of a board meeting that was happening around that time. And it was a pretty complete draft, but there were certainly some gaps in that document at the time. So we committed at that time to filling in those gaps and creating a complete admin draft. And that's what we were doing between October and March. And so the draft that is now on the ODF website is that complete administrative draft. The changes that really happened between October and March were primarily sort of clarifying changes. We were, tightening up the document really and looking at, removing inconsistencies across chapters, making sure that we were, talking about the right things in the right place and trying to, believe it or not, streamline the document as much as we could. There was some new technical information developed during that time, and that's largely what Mike and Nick are going to talk about here in a minute. And we've talked about that in some other venues since then and presented it actually to the board a little bit as well. So most of it probably won't be a surprise to you, but we did want to just, because we hadn't shared it in a fully public forum in the past, we wanted to just catch everybody up on that. A few of those things are really just a little bit more definition on some of the covered activities. We updated some of the acreages that are reflected in the biological objectives to make sure that we are kind of bringing the most up-to-date habitat suitability information in. And then just some updates on management and habitat conservation areas, some more information on retention standards, and some updates and really more detail on the monitoring and adaptive management program. So you're going to hear about more of that here in a minute. And then one other thing I'll just note here, stop this and oops. A couple of times people have mentioned the ODF website, and Sylvia put it in the chat a second ago. And I wanted to just draw your attention to one other thing there. So I'm just going to pull it up, and literally, if you haven't done it before, you literally just Google ODF HCP and it'll be the first link on there. So that's helpful. Let's see if I can get it. Screen sharing is not doing a good job today. There we go. So one other thing I just wanted to point out to you there is that there is the link to the first administrative draft here on this. This is the HCP website. There's also another link right underneath that, which is a summary of key changes from that October draft. So a chapter by chapter summary of the updates that were made. So if you really got invested in that October draft and spent a lot of time reviewing it, and you want to just kind of a crib sheet as to what changed between the drafts, that's a place to go. And it'll provide you that information. So it's just a couple of pages, so it's not really long, but I think it's really helpful. So I wanted to highlight that for the group. And then let me go back. Sorry to toggle between things for you there. So that's all I really have as far as an HCP update. Really just wanted to remind the group that admin draft is available, and that there were a couple of additional tools available on the website for you to look at and see what the changes were. And I think with that, I'll just pass it over to Terry O'Rourke with NOAA Fisheries, and she can provide an update on where things are in the Nepa process.
Did we first want to go to Nick and Mike on some of the more detail here?
We certainly can. Yeah, if you want to go that route and then circle back to Nepa at the end, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. If you want to pull those slides back up, Troy.
Yep. You can see them now.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks. So yeah, let's go into some of these updates at a high level here. So next slide. So first we'll talk about the Conservation Fund and the establishment, funding, and role of the Conservation Fund has now been fully described in the HCP. So the Conservation Fund will be funded at a rate of $5 per 1,000 board feet harvested. And so the funding will come solely from ODF's share of the revenue from timber harvest. So this so it'll function in our budget as a dedicated earmark for conservation projects. This will maintain a funding source that is commensurate with harvest, but also has the flexibility to be applied across the permit area in accordance with conservation priorities. This will provide insulation against swings in the timber market and allow projects to be conducted at a regular pace. It is estimated that the fund will have average expenditures of $325,000 for aquatic projects and an average of $250,000 per year for terrestrial projects, with the remainder being available either to either category as needed over time. Expenditures will be tracked and reported to ensure that funds are being spent on appropriate projects. So these funds will not be used to pay for regular projects associated with timber sales, but for projects that might not otherwise be accomplished. So for instance, the fund would not pay for culvert upgrades along a haul route associated with an active timber sale, which is something we would do anyway as necessary. But it could be used to, say, decommission a legacy road that we don't have any plans to operate in that area. We wouldn't have any nexus to get it done otherwise. You know, we might spend the money on that sort of thing. A large amount of money is anticipated to be spent on barred owl removal for the terrestrial actions. That won't be all the terrestrial actions, but that will, at least at the first part of the HCP, will be a significant amount of that money. Okay, next slide. So monitoring and adaptive management, that chapter has been more rounded out or fleshed out in the HCP to deal with both the aquatic and terrestrial monitoring as well as adaptive management and reporting. Okay, next slide. So the aquatic and riparian monitoring program is going to focus in on habitat monitoring, and basically the water quality and quantity and also structure. So we're partnering with ODFW to implement, to continue to implement and expand their aquatic inventory program within the permit area. And it's going to include metrics on wood recruitment, in-stream habitat structure, for instance, pools and off-channel habitat, stream temperatures, and some general sediment, such as sediment and fine riffles and so forth. there will be more targeted sediment and turbidity monitoring associated with certain activities such as stream crossings, for instance, before or after control impact study designs, and so forth to look at those impacts. Okay, next slide. So terrestrial monitoring will focus on the overall trends in habitat quality and quantity over time, primarily in conjunction with forest inventory updates and harvest activities. Specific effectiveness monitoring will be conducted to document the efficacy of silvicultural activities intended to enhance habitat. And then species monitoring will be used to document the overall response of species to the conservation actions, but for both passive and active management. So those silvicultural activities within habitat conservation areas intended to accelerate and promote the development of habitat, of course, are of special interest there. And next slide. So species monitoring is basically intended to monitor species distribution in response to the conservation strategy. Even though the biological objectives, goals and objectives of the HCP are not tied to individual members or numbers or populations or what have you of the species, we know that species presence can be used to validate those management approaches. So monitoring focus will vary through the permit term, and the specific monitoring projects will be revisited each IP period. So a good example of that would be barred owl control measures that are implemented, say during the first decade. Will be monitored, basically northern spotted owl response to those measures, and then evaluated at the end of the IP period, and say, to determine whether or not to continue that control measure strategy, and so forth. Okay, next slide. So the reporting schedule for the HCP involves annual reporting and these 10-year comprehensive reviews that go with the IPs, as well as these 5-year midpoint check-ins to make sure that we're on track to achieve those IP objectives as they relate to the HCP. So annual reporting will focus on compliance with HCP strategies, including reporting on covered activities such as the harvest of suitable habitat outside of HCAs and number of stream crossings, for instance. They'll document the results of species habitat surveys, as well as accounting for conservation fund expenditures. The 5-year midpoint check-ins will be used to report habitat trends, as well as a summary of all annual reporting items to allow for any corrections necessary to meet the implementation goals for a specific 10-year period. And then finally, that 10-year comprehensive review will be used to assess the overall implementation period. And this is going to provide a basis for setting objectives for the next implementation cycle, allow for the interpretation of those monitoring results, and provide the opportunity to adjust operational policies and programs to further optimize the implementation of the conservation actions. Which leads us into adaptive management. Next slide, please. So adaptive management is going to be used at all levels within the HCP to address policy and operational concerns. Monitoring is going to provide an informational basis for making these adjustments based on specific triggers. So while adaptive management can be applied at any point during the permit term, the most formal analysis and consideration of changes will be during the 10-year comprehensive review. So adaptation to large-scale environmental changes such as climate change will be conducted in conjunction with other state and federal efforts. So there is a nexus to larger efforts outside of ODF and the HCP in that respect. Okay, and now I'll turn it over to Nick to talk about some more specific management actions.
Thanks, Mike. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Palizzato. I'm the lead wildlife biologist for ODF on both projects, on the HCP and the FMP. And today I'm going to be talking about timber harvest, primarily in the HCAs. So the habitat conservation areas, or HCAs, are the primary strategy that we're using to achieve the biological goals and objectives for the covered species. And as a reminder, those biological goals and objectives are to support the species, the persistence of the species in the permit area by conserving, maintaining, and enhancing habitat. And this last objective, to enhance habitat, is where management actions, the management actions I'll talk about today, come into play. Oh, sorry, you can go to the next slide. It's just raring to go. So the HCAs themselves comprise approximately 275,000 acres, or 43% of the permit area. And that includes counting the riparian conservation areas therein. And the map on the left shows the HCAs on the Astoria district in green, just as a representative example of their general size and distribution in the North Coast planning area. The map on the right shows West Oregon district and is representative of the other two planning areas. And the point there is just that the size and proportion of HCAs vary by planning area and by district and county, based on ownership, on landscape context, species distribution and occurrence data, existing habitat, and a number of other factors. At the permit area level, to categorize the acres therein, about a third of the acres are in HCAs, or in the HCAs are in known occupied sites of the covered species or other high quality habitat. And we're not proposing timber harvest in those areas. Another third of the acres are on either marginal or poor production ground that's difficult or expensive to manage, or in inner gorges and riparian conservation areas. And we're not proposing harvest in these areas either. And then management activities would occur on the remaining acres, which are just under a third of the total acres in the HCAs. Next slide, please. And so while passive management plays an important role in conserving and maintaining the habitat in the HCAs, the HCP will also use active management within the HCAs to help enhance habitat and landscape function for the covered species. And this is an important distinction from management outside of the HCAs. The activities within the HCAs will not be economically driven, although we anticipate positive volume and revenue gains may result from them. But the driver for management activities within HCAs will be to increase the quantity and quality of habitat over the permit term. The pace and scale of activities are designed to minimize short-term negative effects on the covered species while still achieving long-term habitat development. And so most activities will occur in lower quality or non-habitat stands. Less activities will occur in higher quality habitat, and no management will occur in occupied habitat. There's also, those management activities within the HCAs are also subject to seasonal and other restrictions. And so activities are proposed on about 75,000 acres within the habitat conservation areas and would occur primarily within the first 30 years of the permit term so that the habitat gains can be realized during that full 70-year term. And so this translates to approximately 2,500 acres per year over those first 30 years. Next slide. The management activities in the HCAs will follow principles of ecological forestry. such as emulating small-scale natural disturbances, protecting important biological legacies for wildlife habitat, and promoting stand and landscape complexity and diversity. Efforts would focus on areas where management can improve habitat and long-term conditions, and thus activities will occur primarily in younger stands and dense stands with simple structure, with additional focus on conifer restoration in alder-dominated stands and areas with moderate to severe Swiss needlecast infestations. Variable density thinning will be the primary prescription in healthy conifer stands, but we're keeping the full suite of silvicultural tools available for density management to address a variety of stand conditions. And variable retention harvest will be used to treat stands that have limited capacity to develop into habitat over the permaterm. And this includes stands that are infected with Swiss needlecast or alder-dominated stands with little or no conifer component. And reforestation in those retention harvest units and also in heavily thinned areas and patch cuts would focus on creating complex early cereal habitat that will then develop towards high quality habitat for the covered species over the permaterm. So these areas will be planted with diverse tree species appropriate to the area at lower densities and with limited site preparation. Next slide. And so to summarize or sort of split out those 75,000 acres that are candidates for management, or we're proposing management. We're proposing to manage 45,000 acres of healthy conifer stands in HCAs using variable density thinning and other treatments to accelerate development of large trees, canopy layering, and other important habitat attributes for the covered species. And we're proposing to manage an additional 15,000 acres of moderate to severely infected Swiss needlecast stands and 15,000 acres of alder-dominated stands in HCAs. Variable retention harvest would be the primary approach to treat those stands. And so large diameter Doug fir and all other conifer species would be retained in those Swiss needlecast stands. And then all conifers and other hardwood species would be retained in the alder-dominated stands. And again, these activities would occur over the first 30 years to allow time for subsequent habitat development to provide benefits within the permaterm. Next slide. I think that's it for me. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Nick and Mike. And for those of you who are new to the process, that probably felt like a lot of information all at once. And for those of you who have been part of the Habitat Conservation Plan conversations over the past couple of years, you know that some of those topics were really the key issues that were discussed: the conservation fund, monitoring, management, and habitat conservation areas. And that was kind of intended to be a recap of where things landed in that first administrative draft of the HCP. So thanks, Mike and Nick, for that. Let's turn it over to Terry O'Rourke to give us an update on the Nepa process, and then we can open it up to questions and discussions on the Habitat Conservation Plan and the Nepa process. So Terry, over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. This is going to be a PowerPoint-free presentation. And just to quickly update you regarding the Nepa process. So the federal agencies, NOAA Fisheries and Fish and Wildlife Service, will be making a decision. And every federal decision requires an analysis through the Nepa process. And the Nepa process basically asks us to determine whether or not something that the decision that we're making is something that aligns with the environmental impact statement, which is what we're preparing. And the environmental impact statement will look at the alternative for the habitat conservation plan that's presented as the admin draft. And then we'll also be looking at other alternatives. And the decision that we'll be making is whether or not to issue an incidental take permit. So the federal decision space is whether or not to issue an incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act. And the process for NEPA is that we identify the purpose and need for the project, and then we hold a scoping period. And in that scoping period, we ask for public comment, and that scoping period just ended. Usually it's a 30-day comment period, but there was a request for an extension. So we extended that comment period by 14 days. And at this point, we're reading and analyzing those comments and coming up with ideas for alternatives. Once we move through that process, we'll be developing the draft environmental impact statement, and we will have a public comment period that will allow people to comment on the proposed action, which is the admin draft of the Habitat Conservation Plan, and the other alternatives that are presented. And then once we receive that public comment, we will take that into account and publish a final environmental impact statement. And from that, we'll make a decision whether or not to issue an incidental take permit. So I kind of think of it as four big buckets: the scoping period, and then the draft EIS, and then the final EIS, and then the decision. And so we're done with the scoping period, and we've moved into the development of the draft EIS. Just to give a little bit of background as to what's been happening from January until now. In January, we started working with the consulting team, getting them familiar with the Habitat Conservation Plan. And we asked the team to review the stakeholder meetings that have been happening over the years in the development of the HCP, so they had a good understanding of the issues. So we didn't start off with the scoping period not having any understanding or experience with the history. We really dove down into those stakeholder meetings so we could get a good understanding of the issues. Then in February, we had tribal consultation. We met with a number of tribes who chose to participate in that. March, we had the scoping period open. In April, it was extended, and then we've been analyzing those comments. In May, we focused on alternative development, and then June through December, it will be the development of the draft EIS. And then we're hoping that the public review period will happen sometime late December, early January of 2022. And that is the next opportunity for public comment on the EIS.
All right.
So at this, yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. Yeah, anything else?
Troy did put up a schedule earlier that showed all three processes. And so I thought if we could maybe post that again, and I would just take people through that middle green section, which is the NEPA process. So looking at the green, the public scoping period says 30 days, but it was actually 30 days plus 2 weeks. And we're in that May section where we're talking about working on the draft EIS, and then that kind of darker green section goes until sometime around December, January, where the public review and comment on the draft EIS will happen. And again, that's the next time for public involvement. And then based on those comments that we receive, we'll complete the final EIS, and that'll be published. And then after a period of time, usually it's a cooling off period, we'll publish a record of decision. And after that record of decision is published, we will either issue or not issue the incidental take permit. And so that is the NEPA process. And I'm sure people have questions, so I thought I'd keep my presentation short and allow for anyone to ask questions.
Great, thank you, Terry. And a link to that schedule is in the chat as well, if anyone wants to reference it some more. So we'll open it up to any questions at this point. We don't have any particular discussion questions for the group, but if you have any clarifying questions or anything you want to know more about, just please go ahead and raise your hand in the platform or just wave your hand. You can't find the button, but if you find the reactions button at the bottom, there's a raise hand icon in there. All right, see a question from Mark. And also just a reminder to say your name and affiliation, even if you already said it, because we don't all know each other.
Mark Rasmussen from Mason, Bruce and Jord. Hey, Mike, I have questions on the species monitoring program. Two questions. The first one is, what are you monitoring against? Do you have some target number of species that you're hoping to achieve?
No, not in the HCP. It is a habitat objective. But I'll let Nick speak a little bit more to our objectives with species monitoring, since we're not, obviously not running a survey and manage program with an HCP. So Nick, go ahead and.
Yeah, I mean, it's primarily, most monitoring would occur within the habitat conservation areas and be looking at, are we in fact hitting that goal of persistence, right, of the species? So it's not just habitat, but is the species in fact persisting in areas of known occupancy? And then are they also using, as habitat grows in the HCAs over time, are they using new areas therein? That's sort of the quickest way.
So if you have the same number of owls at the end of 70 years as you have now, then that's success? Or how do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's not pegged to species numbers again. And so success is, have we met the targets for habitat defined in the HCP, technically defined in the biological objectives? With the current rates of decline for spotted owls, one could argue that yes, that would be success 70 years out from now. I think we're hoping for a better result.
But you don't have a target at this point, or?
No, there's no target set in the HCP for numbers of owls.
Yeah, I know it's not in the HCP, but you don't have any rule of thumb. We hope to see a 10% increase or a 200% increase, or you don't have any discussions like that?
No.
Okay. So my second question has to do with the cost of the species monitoring. What I remember when we started the HCP was part of the reason for pursuing an HCP was the department was spending a lot of money on monitoring under take avoidance, and you wanted to eliminate that. And I guess you're not going to eliminate it, but how does the cost of monitoring under the HCP compare to the cost of surveys under take avoidance?
Yeah, so on the cost side, another sort of quickest way to describe it is it keeps those costs relatively fixed to what we're spending currently, as opposed to what we've been experiencing over 2 decades of increasing costs. It gets a little speculative, but as an example, when the spotted owl protocol changed and we doubled the number of visits, that essentially doubled our costs. There's similar discussions underway for marble murrelet protocol in terms of the amount of effort needed. So you could speculate that our costs will increase there as a result of revisions to the protocol. As new species are added, the costs of those species are added in a take avoidance context. This fixes those costs over time. And we're spending that money asking questions about species responses and species, we're asking more valuable questions for the species conservation than simply, timber sale clearance. And we're able to do so in a more rigorous way that informs those questions in robust, perhaps statistically robust manners.
I might add to that too is the other challenge with using the take avoidance approach where we do the T&E surveys, we have to do them for several years ahead of the timber sale. And depending on whether the area has, whether we detect the species or not, we may have to adjust that timber sale boundary or drop the timber sale altogether or apply additional restrictions. And so that is costly and inefficient in and of itself, that operation by operation approach. And then if there's any gap in terms of when the site is actually harvested relative to when the last survey was, we have very little room for that. And so we're either pushing a purchaser or having to resurvey.
Yeah, I get all that. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Other questions on the HCP or the NEPA process? Laura. Oh, and you're on mute, Laura.
Darn it. Sorry, this is Laura Wilson with Hampton. I think this question will probably go to you, Terry. So you mentioned that the month of May is when you're looking at potential alternatives that will be included in the EIS. I know that there was some submitted in scoping, and I think that you guys, have a no action or a kind of a baseline one that you guys will do too. So are those what's going to be included in the EIS in terms of alternatives? Are those going to be like made known to the public or to the Board of Forestry or something before EIS, or will we not know what's going on until that draft EIS is released towards the end of this year?
Yeah, at this point, we're reviewing all of the comments that we gathered. And from that, we will be developing alternatives, but we're not going to have everything that was presented in scoping as alternatives because we're supposed to be looking at a reasonable range of alternatives. So it'll be a smaller subset. Mm-hmm. We will have a summary of all of the comments that were received, and the public can view all those comments right now by going to regulations.gov, and you can see every single comment that was put out there. The next time that the public will have a chance to review and input is when the draft EIS is released.
Okay, so it sounds like the answer is no, then, that we won't know what alternatives are being included during that EIS analysis.
That is correct. There's nothing that's public between now and the release of the draft EIS.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and thanks, Terry, for the clarification. And Doug.
Oh, there we go. Doug Cooper with Hampton. I appreciate Mark's question on the cost. Just thinking back to what he mentioned about some of the intention and benefit of the HCP was going to be a reduction in cost to the department and the state. And, I have to, just wonder if the department hasn't grossly underestimated what the cost of adaptive management and monitoring is going to be to the state. So that's just a comment. And then also appreciated Mike acknowledging that there are conservation projects that are completed as part of the timber sales program embedded in that. And I wondered, maybe I should have seen something like this or asked about it before, but does the department have any type of quantification or measure reporting on the conservation projects and improvements that are a result of the timber sale program?
To some extent we do, at least for aquatics, which is really, primarily what we do currently. We have projects, we report our projects to OWEB. And so those come back to us and we make those, they are part of annual reports and so forth, I believe, maybe not all of it. But you know, things like barrier removal, you know, for replacing or improving a fish passage on a culvert or something. And then also other restoration we do if we're putting large wood in the stream and such. We do report those to OWEB.
Okay, thanks.
And can you say who OWEB is for those that might not know?
Oh, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, anything else? Other questions, thoughts? Okay. Well, with that, I think we can move into some next steps and then hand it over to Liz for a closing. So let's pull up that next step slide. And also just a reminder, after Liz closes, we do have some time for informal discussion if people do want to stay on and talk about anything that came up today. But if not, we can always end the meeting early as well. So just in terms of next steps, again, appreciate all of the participation today, and the next meeting open to the public to provide an update on the forest management plan and other pieces will likely be held in October 2021. So we'll let you know about that date. And also, if there were any topics that you want to discuss in a smaller group setting about the FMP, you know, ODF is open to requests for having more conversations with people on those topics. So just send an email to the next slide that shows the email addresses. Actually, I think it's 2 more slides. So we'll post those up. One more. So these are the FMP contacts. I'm just going to share them now. I mean, the HCP and FMP contacts. So Cindy Kolomaczyk is the HCP project manager, and you can send an email to her if you have any questions about the HCP. And then again, Sarah Lathrop is the project manager for the forest management plan. And you can also send an email to her if you have any other questions. And we'll put that information in the chat too, once we put these slides down. And with that, I think we can take down the slides and turn it over to Liz to close us out of kind of the more formal part of our meeting today.
Sure. Thank you, Sylvia. Well, I'll just start off saying really appreciate everyone being here the same way that we opened. Really grateful for that. Definitely those of you that have been hanging in there for a long time on this policy work really started the thinking around a revised approach to managing these forests back in 2012. So it has been a long haul. And those of you that have been with us all along the way, appreciate your continued engagement. And then those that are just sort of jumping into the fold here, welcome. And I hope you continue to stay engaged and share your insight and ideas. I took a lot of notes today, and we'll definitely debrief internally and think about what we heard from you all. Managing this public land base for multiple benefits brings all these different voices and perspectives together. And the discussion around a task force is intriguing to me, and finding a way to bring those voices to the table that is collaborative and seeking to find a solution where people may have to compromise, but ideally we end up with the best possible outcome. So I'm going to be really thinking hard around the best way to do that. It is a tall task, I would say, to secure greatest permanent value off of this land base, but we have a great team here at ODF that's extremely committed to that, and most of the folks here that have joined the meeting from Department of Forestry have spent their whole careers working on just that. So appreciate everyone being here and look forward to more.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that. Okay, so I think that closes out kind of our agenda for the day. So those that have to hop off, thank you so much for your participation. And if anyone wants to stay on for a conversation, just raise your hand and staff is available to answer any other questions. But if not, then I think we'll all hop off. Just give it a a few seconds here for any hands, any last questions. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the day and see you all next time. Take care. Oh, wait, there is a question. If folks can stay on, yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I just want to thank you for putting things in the chat, but for some reason, your chat, unlike previous Zoom chats, will not copy and paste. So I've historically copied and pasted the beautiful kinds of information you're posting so that I can immediately just use it. And it's not working for some reason, and I don't know whether there's any available fix in the time that we have left.
Hey, let me know what you need, the information you need. I've got your email address. I'll just send it to you.
Oh, thank you for your help.
Yeah, you know what? I'll just grab everything that was in the chat and send it to you. That'd be the simplest thing.
Yeah, that's fine. Just, just as a text file, it works. That's what I normally do to chats because I can screen capture, but then I have to meticulously write all these long URLs out, and that's hard.
I understand. We're working on getting a good URL shortener to make that a little bit easier as well.
Well, thank you for your help. And another thing I'm actually curious about is in the background of that last group of slides, you have a really fabulous image of older forest. Can anybody say where that image was actually taken? Where is that location?
That's a good question. And I think Sarah maybe dropped off, and that is a slide that she developed. So we'll have to find out and get back to you.
It would be great to get an email giving that information. I've never seen such beautiful forest on state lands. So it's fabulous and I like it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, Sylvia. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.